Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure you guys are all ready to learn about our trial that we've just wrapped up. It was a 3-year study, and a few years ago we were approached by a producer in this area who was seeding winter wheat in early August, turning the cows out in October, and then grazing them until April, and then later that year pull off a silage crop. We thought this would be a pretty interesting project, so we partnered with Ducks Unlimited for a year. They gave us some funding, and we partnered with West Central Forage to see if they'd be interested in doing the project up in Evansburg to see if there was any difference or application in a different part of the province. And after that 1 year of funding, Brian Bears actually from AAFC in Lethbridge came to us with some funding to do some winter wheat research, and we decided that this quickly would be a project that he'd be on board to help us with, so this gave us the additional funding that we needed to complete the project. And we wanted to address questions like which winter cereal and variety would perform the best, and would seed treatments help, would they pay? So Ducks is interested in winter wheat. Obviously it provides good nesting habitat for ducks, and we're pretty sure when we found this, though, they're not ducks. So we partnered with Scott Lair, Scott's in the audience here, Short Grass Ranches just northeast of Medicine Hat. And we put our plots on the same land, on irrigated land that he was doing the same practice with. And so he would seed, turn the cows out, and then try and take a silage crop off. Our plot research is somewhat standard, I guess you'd say. We always seed 4 reps to try and get a good randomization. And so most of our stuff is pretty standard, I guess you could say. And we'd never dealt with livestock before, so cattle was something new for us. And they're kind of unpredictable, I guess you could say. So there were some hurdles for us to jump over and procedures that we had to adapt to fit this type of research. So for an example, we typically seed our plots 2 meters wide, 6 meters long, and then in the spring we'll come back through and seed pathways so that it keeps the weeds down and can control that kind of thing. And in this situation we felt that this probably wasn't the best option, because then there might be some preferential grazing by the cows. If we had a bunch of bare ground around the plots, they might avoid that area, and then it would sort of not really help us with the trial and the research. So we wanted to make sure that we solid seeded as best we could so that it matched what Scott was doing on his fields. And as I mentioned, we partnered with West Central Forage in Evansburg for this trial. They seeded the same plots that we did. The only difference was they didn't have a producer that was interested in doing the animal portion, so they decided they were just going to use clippings to stimulate the grazing. We quickly found out that this system does not work throughout the province. It was hard for them because they couldn't get the plants established and grow enough to produce enough biomass for the cattle to have sufficient feed for the winter. And they also had a hard time getting in to seed the plots. They have more fall rain, they get earlier frosts, and those types of things. So this is something that's fairly localized that we can perhaps continue to do in southern Alberta. Over the years, Farming Smarter's hosted a number of international interns, including Sophie. She was from France. She decided when she got here that one of the projects she needed to do was complete a report on one of our trials, and she picked this one. So it's a pretty interesting concept. I think something that Canadian schools could perhaps look at incorporating into our programming is to have an international component where you'd go and do some research and write a report on something that's happening in a different part of the world. Our first trial, we did 2 separate trials on Scott's land. The first was this 2-factor study where we were looking at winter wheat, fall rye, and triticale, and then blends of those. And we looked at a forage and grain variety of each. And then we were also looking at whether it was any help with treatment of seed. So we used Cruiser Max Vibrance. We had our objectives. We were going to evaluate economic and agronomic potential of winter grazing systems on cereal production, any effect on biomass and silage yield, any differences in the crop type or variety, and anything with winter survival with the seed treatments, and see if there was any benefit for the silage and the grazed versus ungrazed trials and the potential for us to carry those trials through to yield. So I want to emphasize this project was a forage study. So we were looking specifically at the amount of biomass that was produced. It wasn't really necessarily a grain trial, but we wanted to make sure that we had that data just in case there were farmers that may consider this as a practice in the future. We wanted to see if any of the cultivars or seed treatment provided any significant results. And Scott had offered his cattle supplementary feed, but said they rarely touched it. One of the ladies told us it was actually really high in feed value and compared it to crack for cows. So when we took these samples, we took subsamples of each plot and then aggregated them so that we had treatment samples to send for analysis. And the reason we did that was just a cost. It was too cost prohibitive for us to send each plot sample to the lab for analysis. And at this point, there's no, all the values look similar. There's no numerical differences between the feed values. So we haven't done stats on it yet, but it doesn't look like there's any difference in the feed value. As I mentioned earlier, this study was pretty different from most of our small plot research trials because we had those unpredictable cows. One of the things we had to reconsider using was these whitewood stakes. So typically we'll pound them in the ground and then do our plant counts. We'll take a meter stick and put it in between in the middle at the white stake, and we'll count in the fall and then again in the spring to see what our winter survival looks like. And so with Scott having the cows and dealing with them on a more regular basis, we were consulting him on what we could do and what would be the best idea because, as you know, cows are very curious creatures and they would likely pull those wood stakes out of the ground and we'd lose our spots. So we had to come up with something that would work for us and also for him. He was concerned about the animals, making sure that there was nothing that was going to hurt their feet or their hoofs so that he didn't have to deal with any additional problems. And so we came up with this idea here on the left, and it's basically just a piece of wood, plastic tarping with a nail driven into the ground all the way so that there was nothing sticking up. So this gave us that consistent measure so we could do our plant counts, and nothing happened with the cows, so it worked out well. This gives us an example of our plant counts. So we were looking at winter survival, and you can see that between the grazed and ungrazed, there's a significant difference. So the ungrazed had on average 63% survival, whereas our ungrazed had 100% survival. And there was no difference on the plots that had cruiser on them, just as a note there. Winter wheat also tends to be more susceptible to winter losses. This is why we initiated the second trial, which we'll talk about just in a few minutes. And we noticed that the blends that had the winter wheat also mainly consisted of the other two types of crops. So whether it was triticale or rye, the majority of the plot that survived wasn't the winter wheat, it was the other two. So this is what our field typically looked like in April after Scott pulled the cows off. He had a number of fields each year under this grazing system, and ironically, he didn't keep any of the fields that we had our trials on, as he felt the stands were really spotty, and so he ended up reseeding in the spring, which, as he's mentioned to us, he still feels is a good value. He gets to keep the cattle on the land, and he feels like he gets the value from that. Scott, by the way, if you notice, there may have been good data to suggest you could have kept some of those fields. And this could also indicate that it's more of a grazing timing issue and intensity. So this system could be more effective and more data could be collected. And you can see that there is good distribution of the manure throughout the field, so they did graze through the trial effectively. The grazed trials in the foreground versus the ungrazed trials in the background, you can see that the treatments perfectly line up. And we also noticed that the seeding too early in the fall actually causes the plants to become stressed, and we have higher winter kill. So as I mentioned, these unpredictable cows, we had additional challenges there. So we decided instead of using range cages, which are typical for forage studies, we were going to make this system work in our small plot research world. So we fenced off an entire trial. So we seeded 2 identical trials and fenced off one as an exclusion for the cattle. And I think that the reason for that is because you can tell cows where you want them to graze, but they're not going to listen. So we wanted to make sure that they kept this one ungrazed, so we fenced it entirely. And it was a good thing that Scott never had this to worry about. They actually listened, stayed off the fences, and grazed only the grazed trial. As I mentioned, Cruiser was used to see if it would provide any sort of boost to the plants to survive the winter. And it was very clear that it did not provide any value from all of our trials. So grazing significantly impacted this winter survival, but the Cruiser really didn't make much difference. So you can see the 2 brown versus the 2 green versus the brown and the green. Each year there was really not a significant difference between the check and the seed treatment. Comparing the grazed versus ungrazed. Mary mentioned this morning you need to consider the green bridge when employing strategies like this. So you want to make sure you have enough time with the dead tissue to reduce your chances of getting a wheat streak mosaic problem. And now you know that the cows won't help you remove the wheat curl mites. What makes winter cereals able to withstand this type of system is the growing point is under the ground. So unlike some of our other plants where the growing point is above ground, these types of plants can withstand it. And when you also have the grazed site on the left, you can see what? A lot of bare ground. And what happens when you have bare ground is you get a lot of weeds. So lack of crop competition allows for weeds to start taking over the plots. And in 2016, we had a significant issue with this. The plots in that trial, we couldn't harvest. We ended up with some massive weed issues. And Scott doesn't normally do herbicide applications because he has intercropping with tillage radishes. But after this year, we decided to add a pyroxasulfone treatment in the fall with our burn down to try and get some residual weed control. And when you have a healthy stand and healthy crop competition, this is what it looks like. So it's a pretty significant contrast. And keep in mind, Scott never kept any of these trials. So this is what his stand could have looked like, even though he got rid of it. Being a forage trial, we were interested in the amount of plant material that grew. So we sampled the amount of growth in the fall and then again in the following year to get a silage biomass. All of these cultivars produce similar biomass results, and they're not statistically different. So overall, the triticale had a higher biomass than winter wheat, rye, and the blends, but there will also be differences in the palatability for the animals as well. So we didn't collect silage biomass in 2016 because of the weed problem that I showed you. So that data from that year has been excluded from the chart just because we couldn't collect it. So when you look at this, you can hopefully see that we're trying to get a value for the double cropping. So you're going to go in and you're going to take the silage off in the fall, and you're going to graze that, and you get a value. These are min and max values, 1.5 to 3.6, and then silage value, 7.6 to 8.2, for a total average of all of our data for 9.8 tons per hectare. And when you look at the ungrazed, so you're only removing the plant material once in the following year after seeding, you're getting an average of 8.7. So you're actually getting more plant material by grazing than you are without. So that grazing always outproduced the ungrazed sites. So as I mentioned many times, this was a forage-based trial, but we felt like we wanted to keep it through to yield just to see if what was going to happen and what kind of yields they might get. So if a farmer had too much silage or prices were good, he could keep the crop in the spring and see if he could get something good out of it in the end. Only 2 out of the 5 years, our cultivars produced a significantly different yield from one another, but we haven't done overall statistics on the cultivar yields. And again, the Cruiser did not have any significant effect. So on average, you can see all of the grazed, for the most part, the blue bars are higher than all the orange bars, which are the ungrazed. The second trial we conducted was in conjunction was the forage trial was a winter wheat seeding date trial. So we noticed a lot of times that if you're going to take a crop to yield, that winter wheat would likely be the one that you would choose. And so we took ptarmigan and moats, and we looked at both the treated and untreated, as well as the 3 seeding dates. So these 3 seeding dates were sort of a guideline. Mother Nature doesn't always agree with us that these should be the dates that we should seed on, so we did as best we could to get to these dates, and we'll talk a bit more about that. So for this trial, we conducted similar data collection for this one as we did for the forage. So note, this one is the graze trial. There's no whites. There's the white stakes. Cycat here is showing us why he was so much faster at plant counts. He's super flexible. And you can see I actually work. I was outside too, so it was cold, but not that day. So we did the fall biomass, like I said, and I have to admit, this was a ton of work. So these were really full days. We typically had a super large crew. We took everybody we could, and high five, because we're almost done. And you can see the amount of feed was pretty significant in the fall. For this slide, again, we excluded the data from 2016 just because we were unable to collect the silage timing biomass. And you can see the trend in blue here, and that was the amount of biomass produced and the feed that you got. So the earlier you seeded, obviously, the more biomass you had to graze throughout the winter. But if you look at date 2, you can see that in the spring, that more than accommodated for what was taken off on the graze trial. So even though you seeded later and don't get the winter forage value, that biomass still ended up coming higher. And overall, the grazed, again, is higher than the ungrazed. So the seeding date trial, you can look, the second year, we tried to go closer to our August 1st timeline, and you can see that it is by far the lowest. So when you look at seeding, Mary was saying, you know, each day you delay seeding, you lose a bushel per acre, but our results tend to indicate that the mid-September is probably your best time frame. So is the grass really greener on the other side of the fence? Lewis seemed to think so. He really loved doing biomass. So in summary, a few points here to note. There is good potential to fall graze the winter cereals. There's high feed value for all treatments. Fall rye and winter triticale have the most hardiness, winter hardiness. And the early seeding date increases the fall biomass, but also decreases the summer silage and grain yields. Winter survival decreased with grazing significantly on all years. And more work may be needed on the grazing intensity and the timing. So we've talked to Scott about potentially looking at getting the cows out a little earlier to see if that would help with winter survival. And I guess just to reiterate that the double harvest outperformed the single one in all of our years, and it boosted both the biomass and the yield production. And that's it. I have time, I think, for a couple questions if anybody has any. Thank you.